activity in which these marks are used. In sort of my time using this, usually I've never had anyone get 6 out of 6, but I have had 5 out of 6 just on Tuesday. So I'd be delighted if you could beat the undergraduates from Tuesday. But that's really less important than can you identify the different kinds of activity that are going on here. So this will sort of help to set up the seminar. And in the meantime, I'm going to send around a piece of paper for you to just write your name and your surname, instead of me having to sort of call out all of the names. Okay, so we'll try to do that for a few minutes. Which will perhaps be more obvious to those of you, especially those of you who studied at Glasgow, is that you can kind of see that the particular way that it's written sort of echoes the Macintosh style. Do we have, I think we have students here from Glasgow, don't we? Yeah, that's right, isn't it? Yeah. It has that kind of particular look about it. So you sort of see them linking sort of the football club directly to its place by sort of referencing the style with which sort of Glasgow has become associated. This one?
Doctors Without Borders.
Yes. And this one? Yep. Okay, so in your group, so having identified all this is actually very good. And in particular, you know, there are some, like Interflora and Doctors Without Borders, that tend to cause a bit of difficulty because perhaps they're less sort of visible, whereas this one is sort of hands down always the easiest one to get. This is sort of ubiquitous. What fields of activity does this cover? What are the fields of activity that it covers? I mean, trademarks aren't isolated, they're on something.
Advertising.
So, someone at the front here? Or could someone at the front here say something?
Yeah, advertising.
Advertising, yes. And what are they advertising? What kinds of things? Fashion is one, yep. And not just fashion, also specifically luxury fashion. Fashion is a huge one. So in terms of branding and the significance of a mark, it makes a massive difference whether on, say, your handbag clasp it has this logo as opposed to another one. So this becomes something that's quite valuable, both sort of in fashion and as a mark. What other kinds of fields of activity? Yes, exactly. So something like a social media platform. So they're dealing with communication. It's not like it's an obvious thing, like you are selling something. Good. Someone from the back row. Anything else? A service? I heard someone say, yeah. So obviously when we look at marks, we're covering not only goods, but also services. I mean, this is perhaps an obvious point, but quite an important one. It covers all kinds of different endeavors, whether they're to do with communication, for the sale of goods, also sort of sports. You will also, of course, have marks in relation to particular cultural events as well. And the one that I think is particularly interesting is this one. So this is an NGO, right? And what we might ordinarily sort of associate trademarks purely with these sort of very sort of standard commercial activities, but actually they're also important to charitable organizations. Incident that includes universities. This will also have the mark. The final one that I want to mention as to why that one's there, so with Unilever, that's actually quite a useful one in terms of, what was that?
Daily necessity.
Yes.
Daily necessity.
Yes. So not only do we sort of have this as this massive sort of brand that deals with sort of various necessities, so sort of food and other kinds of items, it will also be the owner, probably, of various other marks. I think this is something that we discussed a couple of weeks back. So you have actually a pretty wide spectrum. And the reason we're starting with this is that in today's class, what we're really focusing on is, having moved from brands, we're now zeroing in on trademarks and saying, well, what are they for? And I think it becomes pretty clear, just looking at a snapshot of marks, that they're pretty clearly not only for very sort of narrow buying and selling activities, but they may in fact have a sort of much broader significance. So, just to move on to the seminar itself, you will have seen, although I suspect only if you check your emails so regularly that you checked it about 15 minutes ago, that I put the slides, or an edited version of the slides, on Moodle. There is absolutely no reason for you to look at these before class. It's just that I understand sometimes for students it can be, for whatever reason, easier to have them in advance to sort of get a sense of what we're going to be discussing. So in particular, I don't include the class activities and stuff. I mean, I'm going to say it's to preserve the element of surprise, which is sort of half true. But the idea is that, you know, some of it will just sort of evolve through the class. So I don't want it to be sort of too programmatic about sort of how I approach it. So, you know, if you want to have a look at it, that's fine. Equally, have a look at it after, use it as a sort of perhaps an aid to revision. But again, it's not in any way necessary. But if it's useful, it's there. You will have seen also, while I'm on sort of announcement type things, that I put up a sort of how to find readings document for those of you. I'm hoping that this simplifies things in terms of looking for stuff. If, of course, you do come across something that's proven particularly difficult to find, obviously still feel free to just drop me an email, and I can probably point you to sort of the fastest way to find it. Yes, so that's pretty much it. So what are we looking at today? Like I said, we're looking at assessing the functions of trademarks, but in the context of sort of the broader rationales for trademark protection. Now, this, along with the last seminar, is particularly important in setting up the way we approach the topic from now on. So, I mean, I will say immediately that the 3 seminars after this are incredibly case heavy, and the reading lists, as you will have seen, are very long. There is lots of material. So the idea of this class in particular is to provide you with some routes for understanding that material and assessing it. Some of it, including some of what we do today, will only probably make sense sort of 4 weeks from now, when you have sort of more material to work with. So don't worry too much if you've been reading L'Oreal and Velour and it doesn't really make too much sense, but that's probably because we haven't done dilution yet. So we will come back, it's sort of a circle, we will come back to a lot of the issues that we're looking at now. So we're going to look at sort of the main justifications or rationales for trademark protection. Think about sort of their social and cultural context, including identifying particular critical accounts. So these are represented in your sort of required reading list. You know, whether you've done it before or after class, it doesn't matter. It sort of provides the standard sort of the classic approach, and then sort of much more critical approaches to trademarks. So this is something they don't match up, which is sort of the point. The idea is that you can sort of bring something to it in terms of evaluating the arguments. And we're going to be looking then at sort of these various arguments in the literature in light in particular of the 2 cases that are on your reading list. I'm then going to spend just a little bit of time talking about the routes to trademark registration, and then at the very end have a brief chat to you about Brexit, which continues. Obviously this is something very important and very much not about my preparation, but it's obviously the bane of my existence because something happened 2 hours ago, which suggests that there may or may not be now a withdrawal agreement. So we'll look at sort of the likely consequences of that, which is why, you know, everything is pretty much still with a question mark. So to begin, we begin with this. Now, obviously, I just extracted this on your reading list. This is fairly straightforward, but I think it's absolutely fundamental. A registered trademark is personal property. In Scotland, notably, incorporeal movable property. Why is this essential? This is our starting point for understanding the nature of a trademark. we cannot talk about either the commercial value of trademarks nor their social, cultural, and economic context without understanding that that registration is a form of property. So I think it's very difficult to sort of overemphasize this, but it perhaps shouldn't be surprising to you, especially those of you who are doing other intellectual property classes, that we are dealing with a form of property. Why does this matter? Property is a relationship, right? It's a relationship of power. And when we're looking at a property relationship, we immediately realize that there's probably more at stake here than just, just the person. This is of more relevance than to just the person who owns the property. So this is the key point. Remember, we can have unregistered trademarks. You won't have a property right in those, although you might have goodwill in them and therefore vindicate the property right in passing off. I'm just going to park that until the end of the semester. But when we're talking about registered trademarks, again, it's very important to think of them as property. Like I said, economically, you can license, you can assign, you can gain money purely through the use of your trademark or the licensing of your trademark. And then secondly, because it's property, it raises sort of bigger issues about, is this the kind of property that we want to socially recognize? What is its cultural significance? And this is something that we'll come back to in particular next term in terms of looking at, say, sporting events and the like. Okay, so it's property. Now, if it's property, this immediately raises the question of, is it justifiable to grant a natural person or a company a property right in a trade symbol? Right? I don't want us to sort of treat this as if this is something that is obvious. I think if we're going to be granting property rights, I mean, obviously we are doing it, but if we're going to be sort of looking at a property right, we need to actually have a good reason for why we should do that. So we need to say, well, what function do these trade symbols perform? And specifically, what is the rationale for that protection? Now, the standard account of this is in the Frank Schechter article, and there's this sort of very neat quote where he says, the preservation of the uniqueness of a trademark should constitute the only rational basis for protection. So the idea here is that really it is necessary to protect a mark only to the extent that it's necessary to protect the underlying goodwill of that mark. Now, this is the US. It's also 1927, so this has nothing to do with passing off, but sort of the idea that you're protecting sort of this communicative function of that particular mark. Also, I suspect this will be familiar to you because you read Breakfast with Batman, the Littman piece. What she does is very much engage in a sort of dialogue with this article. So it's actually quite a useful one to read, and perhaps then to go back to Littman just to see exactly how she uses it. So what we see subsequently is the breakdown of the trademark functions, with the first and the primary one very much in line with the Schechter reasoning, saying a trademark is a badge of origin. I mean, again, I don't think I can sort of overemphasize how important this is. This will probably, again, be fairly obvious to you if you've done sort of any of the reading, whether it's sort of the textbook reading or otherwise. This is the primary function of a trademark. It tells the consumer what the origin of goods or services is. What's perhaps a bit more difficult is that there are other functions that flow from that, and then certain extended functions, I'm looking primarily at number 4, relating to investment, that are actually hugely controversial. And this is why we're looking at L'Oreal and why we look again at that case. So here is one way, perhaps, of understanding the trademark functions, or sort of the rationales for protection. One, this origin function. So we move from the statement, a trademark serves as a badge of origin, to a sort of more normative statement saying it should be protected as a badge of origin because it denotes the origin of goods and services in such a way that is helpful to consumers. It is giving consumers information. So this is both its function, and we can say sort of subsequently to that, that's a good rationale for protecting it as property, because it's necessary for consumers to have information about where their goods or services came from. So that's the first argument. The second is we can say that the function of a trademark is an indicator of quality. So we can say in terms of the rationale, it's saying, well, this again is useful for consumers because that badge of origin is also a badge of quality. It tells them something about the goods that they're going to purchase. Now, by the way, when I say quality, the quality could be used as bad. It could be that that trademark tells you that every time you buy that chocolate bar, it's going to taste awful, or whatever it is. The point is that you're going to get some kind of consistency. So the rationale here would be, you should be given this property right because that property right gives consumers information about quality. So what they're saying is it's almost like they're performing a sort of public interest function. I will come back to that, saying, don't worry consumers, you can be assured that you know what you're going to get when you buy this thing. So that's the second one. The third one is that we can argue that trademarks serve an advertising function. Now, obviously, you can sort of see a bit of slippage here. We can probably sort of agree that maybe it's a good thing to give consumer information on origin and quality. It's a little harder to maintain an argument, perhaps, in relation to advertising. But one of the arguments for why we should grant a property right to trademarks is that by arguing that actually trademarks are an important element of advertising, they're an important element of promoting the particular trademark to the consumer, so the consumer is informed about that trademark and what it means. You know, we can argue about the extent to which perhaps this is a good thing, but the other way we can link it to the rationales is to move on to number 4 and say, actually, this also relates to the advertising, to the investment function. So the idea again is that a function of a trademark is to be an investment, and that this is a good thing because it allows the building of this kind of consumer awareness of the mark. When we're not looking at consumer awareness, and we see this in some of the other cases, we can say, well, we should protect the investment that is put into a particular mark. Let's say it's a luxury brand, and you spend loads of money on sort of advertising and promoting the brand, etc., because actually this protects you from some kind of unfair competition by other traders. Or actually you've just put a lot of money into it, so it seems entirely fair that you should get a property right. Again, like I'm saying, these are pretty controversial propositions, but these are certainly rationales that we can see in not just the cases, but also sort of debated in the literature. So a good example of this, because I think it's one that somebody brought up maybe in the first class, was about Apple as a brand. So protecting the Apple trademark is obviously absolutely critical to protecting the investment in Apple both as a brand and the products. That would be the argument. So you provide that property right to allow both the brand and the company to protect itself from infringement. And now you can argue that that's good in terms of protection from unfair competition. You could argue that it's good for consumer welfare because you know that when you see the heartbeat and sort of Apple logo, that consumers know what they're going to get, etc. Now, one of the difficulties, as you will have seen in the cases with the functions, once we move away from this sort of classic exposition of it as the origin function, is that underpinning every argument that I've just made is a particular understanding of economic relations. But in particular, there is a certain understanding of the consumer as rational. This idea that you have a sort of rational consumer who is able to make these choices and distinctions in the market. So I think that's potentially problematic. Also, it obviously ignores a whole other range of factors that consumers may use to actually buy things. Like, for example, what else do you look at apart from the mark, if you do look at the mark? Yeah, absolutely. That's the standard one. You're looking at, yeah, of course you are. You're looking at price. So, you know, there's a sort of a host of other factors that we potentially sort of miss out on by sort of zeroing in on this. And this is what I mean about we will actually come back to discuss sort of a bit more broadly this issue of the public interest. However, before looking at sort of the critical accounts in the literature and also sort of coming back to the functions in the context of public interest, I now want to look at the two cases that are on your list. So first Arsenal and Reed, and then L'Oreal and Velour. They are both really about the trademark functions. We've not done infringement yet, and we're just going to leave that for the moment. But they're really about what is the scope of this property right that you get when you have a registered trademark. So if 2 weeks ago we said we were asking what is a brand for, today really we're asking what is a trademark for. So in the first case, we have Arsenal and Reed. And these are some pictures. There are various signs that were at issue. When they say device, they just mean the picture, the logo. There were also words at issue, obviously the word Arsenal. There were sort of various trademarks in various classes. So I just want to use this as an example for a little bit. I think it's quite useful, not only because it tells us something about the primacy of the origin function, but it also very clearly, I think, tells us something about what happens when the primacy of the origin functions hits up against something that's quite, socially or culturally significant. And I think you don't need to be an Arsenal fan, which is quite difficult sometimes, to appreciate that this is quite important. You can substitute your own team, but sort of the similar issues arise. Now, you won't be able to see this, I think, very well, but this is one of the classes in which, in relation to this specific case, this is the particular class that this trademark dispute related to. This is class 25. So they were saying not nobody can use a trademark. What they were interested in is protecting their trademark in a particular class and classes of goods. So class 25 is the obvious one because, as you can see, it relates to clothing. So perhaps two things are important, and we will, of course, come back to these at various points again. You need to both have a trade symbol or a sign that you can register, and you need to identify what you want it for. So you always have to have both. Usually what you will do is you will identify very specific elements within it. So in class 25, it includes mainly clothing, footwear, and headwear. It includes, in particular, clothing and footwear for sports. So it makes sense that a football club would be in this. I should just add that it doesn't include certain other things like paper party hats and doll's clothes. They'll be in like a different class. Yes?
Just to be clear, what kind of classification system is it for? Trademarks
Yes, so I'm going to put up the link to that. So this is the NICE classification. So this is exactly, so this was going to be my point, where this is a sort of worldwide classification. This is the NICE classification for goods and services. So you need to fall within one of these classes. In fact, although I was going to do this at the end, this might in fact be a good opportunity to show it. I will put the link up on Moodle so you can sort of do searches yourselves. It's definitely fun, at least like the first 3 times you do it. You know, just searching sort of for different things. So you can see, this is our NICE classification. 34 classes of goods, not as many for services, but obviously quite substantial. If you do a search, for example, in all classes, you will find, for example, with chocolate, and that you actually get lots of hits and lots of different classes. This is why it actually really matters to identify the class that you want the protection for. So perhaps the reason I really like this example is that it doesn't seem obvious that chocolate would come up in class 11 for lighting and heating installations. But the reason chocolate comes up here is that immediately under toilets is the subclass of chocolate fountains. So not obvious, right? So when you say, you know, you want to have this trademark for chocolate, you're going to need to be very clear about which class it is that your activity is in. So it's not likely to be, I would say, 11. Maybe in class 28, chocolate decorations for Christmas trees. That's, you know, quite specific. That's perhaps also not what you might be after. So there'll be a number. The one that you will want, of course, is the one that says this is for foodstuffs, for chocolate bars, chocolate drinks, etc., etc. The reason I'm also using chocolate as an example is, as we'll see next week, Nestle and various chocolate companies, Cadbury's in particular, sort of has been in a little bit of trouble around this because they want to trademark the colour purple, but they haven't always been very clear about what exactly is the precise ambit of the goods. So like I said, this is an interesting thing to sort of have a look at. The other reason it matters, and again, we'll come back to this in 2 weeks' time, is that you can stop anyone using, once you have your unique mark, you can stop anyone else using it for that class of goods or services. With the big, massive exception, and hence somewhat controversial, of if you're well known, you get additional protection, where you can stop people using your trademark, even in classes of goods where you're not even registered. So this is, you know, this is obviously quite significant. And it certainly does seem to go beyond this sort of the classic representation of the trademark functions. So this is how we get to, you know, a number of classes for Arsenal. And this is roughly what it looks like. The other thing I will put up on Moodle is also the UK trademark search, which if you haven't seen it already, again, is fun for at least the first or second time that you use it. Just look up your name or something like that. Your first name, you'll probably end up with sort of 1,000 hits, unless your name is relatively unusual. But it's quite sort of interesting, you know, to get a sense of sort of what is on the register. But when you look for the specific trademark, so this is a specific trademark, or one of them that was at issue in Arsenal and Reed. So this is the specific number. So if you go to the search, you can just put in the number of the trademark, and it will come up with what is the trademark. The trademark is the word Arsenal. It was filed in 1989, entered in the register in 1990. Arsenal's lawyers will have to make sure to renew it by the 9th of May 2026. It seems very unlikely that they will fail to renew it. This is obviously like a hugely valuable mark. So you will see at the top it says overview, list of goods, names and addresses, publications. So in terms of the list of goods, this is just an extract of what is showing now on the Arsenal page. And you will see class 14, medals and jewellery, fine. Class 16, stationery, folders, playing cards. Basically, all of these kinds of stationery things that are included in class 16, but importantly, not including anything relating to weapons, ammunition, or other military equipment, which must be a relief to anyone who was wondering. Nothing to do with weapons. Class 18, much more obvious, sports bags and cases, key rings, that kind of thing. Class 20, ornaments and picture frames. You can kind of see how in terms of souvenirs and things that a football club might sell, you can sort of see why these might be relevant. Class 21, small domestic utensils, combs, glassware, porcelain. I mean, that just mostly makes me think of, it's just like an Arsenal mug or something. But in any case, they're fairly extensive. It basically means if you want to set up a company, and called Arsenal something or other, chances are you're going to find that very, very difficult, if not impossible to do in terms of selling up kitchen equipment, etc. Incidentally, if you're wanting to sell weapons, you probably wouldn't be able to register Arsenal anyway because it'll be descriptive. Quite apart from any sort of policy issues there might be around that. And then that brings us with Arsenal and Reed to, for every trademark, you're told who owns it, which is sort of quite useful. It might not always be, so here it's Arsenal Football Club, the address is Arsenal Stadium. It won't necessarily be the case. It might be owned by sort of a different company. It might be that there's a company that owns like a whole sort of suite of trademarks. And crucially here you have a law firm name as obviously your IP representative. The club is not doing this themselves. And perhaps the most important thing that you want to have a look at is just to make sure that it continues to remain registered. So this is why that renewal date in 2026 is really quite important. Okay, so it's very clear that Arsenal has registered trademarks. So this is just a quick rundown for anyone who's sort of not clear because there are multiple Arsenal cases. This is effectively a dispute around the sale of scarves. You will have seen for anyone who's been at a football match, this is a fairly sort of standard practice. You have an unofficial seller also selling Arsenal scarves and Arsenal suits. So this is the foundation of the dispute. Yes.
Yeah. Do we need to know whether Arsenal registered in a different country and Arsenal permission?
No. So yes and no. In terms of our focus here, which is primarily on UK trademarks, I know that for those of you who are doing trademarks in other classes, there's likely to be much more EU comparative work, for instance. For us, especially for this class, we're largely looking at UK registration. However, there is no way that this is not registered elsewhere, would be my guess, in terms of Arsenal. I am willing to bet that they've used international filing to have it examined in as many markets as possible. So this question about territory, so trademarks, like every other IP right, is territorial, which means that you're going to want to protect yourself in all kinds of other markets. We're just focusing on the UK market here, but yeah, I would be astonished if they didn't in fact have protection sort of any way that they can get it. Whether it's in the EU, the US, or anywhere else. But because here we're dealing specifically with this trademark, the UK one, it means that they need to bring the action here, and in any case, the man was selling the scarves, exactly in front of their London Stadium. So that makes sense. So it goes to the High Court, and sort of incredibly, the High Court says, look, Mr. Reed isn't using this as a badge of origin, but rather as a badge of allegiance. So immediately sort of set up the legal problem here in relation to trademark functions. Is an Arsenal scarf, or the use of a logo on an Arsenal scarf, or put in your sort of sporting team of choice, is it a badge of origin or is it a badge of allegiance? It's a way that you show that you support, whatever your football club is, or whatever other sporting team. So at that point, because remember, UK trademark law is harmonised with EU law, a preliminary reference is made. And the question is, well, can you infringe a trademark if you're not impeding the badge of origin function? So are you doing something wrong even when you're sort of selling something that's a badge of support, where it very clearly says this is unofficial merchandise? That argument is rejected. In fact, what the ECJ says is that it may be a badge of support, but it still affects the functioning of Arsenal and its logo as a badge of origin. When this then eventually goes to the Court of Appeal, which is the case that you were asked to read, that judgment is applied, and it's held that there was an infringement precisely because there's an impression of this link between Mr. Reed and Arsenal Football Club. So one of the arguments that comes up is says, well, say you buy the unofficial scarf. When you walk off somewhere else, when someone else sees you, for example, they will think that you bought an Arsenal scarf. It's perhaps a bit of a stretch, but it's not going to then be clear that this is unofficial. So, in short, you can't just use another person's or company's trade symbol. Oh yeah, so that's it in colour, or the colour. You can't get around this by simply saying, "Oh, actually, I'm using it unofficially," or it's a badge of support. So, in the CJU, what we have is just this really neat statement about the origin function. And there are 2 points that are quite useful to make here in particular, that it's to guarantee origin. We know that this is a primary function. And that the reason we have to respect that function is that it helps consumers. So this enables consumers, without any possibility of confusion, to distinguish goods and services. So it's saying the origin function is primary, and the reason it's a good thing is that actually it's in some sense increasing consumer welfare. So this is the way this sort of badge of support argument is dispensed with. And on the specific issue, like I said, of there being an infringement, the court goes on to say that it creates the impression that there is a material link in the course of trade between the goods concerned and the trademark proprietor. So in other words, the sale of these unofficial scarves and merchandise with the Arsenal symbols suggests effectively that Arsenal has agreed to these scarves, etc., being sold. So it's suggesting that there is a link between Mr. Reed and Arsenal, which is sort of interesting because it's sort of at pains to say this is unofficial. But actually what the court says is the impression it creates is that there is a link. So the suggestion seems to be that the moment you see the Arsenal logo, you think this is something that's made by Arsenal. Mm-hmm.
Isn't the argument that it's protecting the consumer welfare really poor? Because probably the not original scarves are looking not completely alike, but they're giving them the feeling of, okay, I somehow can show that I'm an Arsenal fan,
Yes.
but for cheaper money. So if I don't have the money, not the monetary situation to buy those original scarves, I think this argument is really poor. Like,
Yeah, so this goes precisely back to the point made about price, right? This isn't the only reason, this isn't the only thing that you
Yeah.
look at. So it might be actually that, on the one hand, consumer welfare in terms of information, you're saying, well, yes, you're making it very clear what this comes from. But is it necessarily for consumer welfare that you can't buy the cheaper thing that will allow you to show your support? And I think actually the answer might be that that's not a consumer problem. It becomes a supporter problem, and trademark law can't really deal with support of that nature. But yeah, this is a huge criticism, I think, of this. And it's a reason that it still remains quite an important case. You know, it was decided in 2003, and we've had sort of endless cases since then. But yeah, I mean, I think sort of instinctively we can say, well, you just want to show your support. You're not sort of interested in sort of Arsenal, the company, or you know, whatever football team it is. But almost as if sort of directly in response to that comment, the court goes on to say, well, once it's been found that the sign is liable to affect the badge of origin function, it's immaterial that the sign is perceived as a badge of support or loyalty or affiliation to the proprietor of the mark. So it's almost like saying, so it's possible that you might see it as a badge of support, but the minute it interferes with that sort of commercial sort of origin function, they're like, well, actually, we're not interested, because this is the core function of the mark. So all the rest of it doesn't really matter. The other thing I think that's quite interesting is that it's a badge of support for or loyalty or affiliation to the proprietor of the mark. See, I also wonder about the extent to which this would be the understanding of the supporters, as supporters rather than consumers, in the sense that, yes, the proprietor of the mark is Arsenal Football Club, but my suspicion would be, or at least for me personally, it's like you're supporting that particular club, you know, the players, the particular team. It's not really like a badge of support for that team as incorporated in a company. So there's a sort of there's sort of like a lot going on here. I think that's quite interesting. So like I said, this then goes to the Court of Appeal. So this is why we're now at ETMR 73 and not 19. In the Court of Appeal judgment. And I guess my question for you is, badge of origin or badge of support, what does the court actually say? How does it deal with this? Okay, let's just bear in mind that you're sort of bound to actually apply. You can't actually just ignore the ECJ, right? They've told you how to sort of approach it. So how does the court approach it here? I mean, does anyone remember? What does the court say about the evidence?
Yeah, I think this is Mr. Ray used as not trademark use. Maybe he used the Arsenal's arguments and say it's the infringement to the Arsenal's trademark.
I know that's in the High Court.
Yeah.
But then that got overturned. So actually what you said, but the opposite in the Court of Appeal.
Okay.
So this is actually really useful, right? So in the High Court, that's exactly what they said. They said he wasn't actually using it as a trademark. It was a badge of support. It said that it was unofficial. It then goes to the CJU, it gives guidance, and the Court of Appeal says, well, actually, now that we look at the evidence in light of this, it turns out that it was infringing. I appreciate that also what might have happened here is because there are so many different cases that possibly everyone read a different one. There are at least 3, which is fine. So they were interested in sort of looking at it beyond, you're wearing this at the stadium or at that sort of point of sale, but in fact that these are goods that then circulate, and therefore it's sort of performing a particular communicative function. And that the thing that it's communicating is, oh, this must be approved by Arsenal, or there is sort of some link between them. Okay, so bearing that in mind, this is our discussion question, which might also sort of serve as, I guess, like a revision question or something like that. And that is, what does the reasoning in Arsenal and Reeve reveal about the cultural significance of trade symbols? Give evidence from the judgment and your own further reading. I mean, I think I might actually expand that precisely based on this problem of there being sort of multiple judgments to say, if you like, which of these judgments do you actually prefer or find compelling? You know, I mean, we know sort of what the outcome is, but when you sort of, you can have two completely opposed decisions. So what I'd like you to do in groups, just for 5 minutes, and then we'll have a break, is come up with effectively like a sort of short introduction to this. It'll just be a few sentences. I'm not going to ask anyone to read it unless you want to, when we come back. But what does it reveal about the cultural significance of trade symbols? So you can use the Court of Appeal judgment, you can use the other judgments, the other Arsenal judgments. You can also use pretty much everything that you read from 2 weeks ago, I think, and sort of incorporate it. So we'll have sort of 5 minutes for that and then a break, and then we'll come back and talk about L'Oreal. Okay, go. Just bearing in mind that you might want to come back to this in 4 weeks' time. This would be like your final answer. Anyone? Or if not, I can appreciate from some of the comments that there have also sort of been questions about, yes, but what are we actually being asked? Right, which is always sort of the tricky one. So if you haven't sort of got an introduction together, perhaps some reflections on what is the question actually asking? Anyone?
I think the cultural significance is kind of, in this case, is the loyalty, right? The support.
Yes.
Yeah, right. So I think this question is just discuss about some, other cultural significance, not just loyalty. Maybe it's kind of to protect environment, some kind of this thought that is built upon this trademark, but you don't use it as a trademark.
Yeah, so this neatly encapsulates one of the difficulties in setting a question like this now, before we've done the substance, because very obviously this isn't just about trademark functions, but it's about how you're using it. And this little word use obviously is sort of defined at length in the case law on trademark infringement, which we'll look at in 3 weeks' time. And what it sort of directs you to is saying, well, this is about, obviously trademarks serve a sort of function in trade in terms of being a badge of origin, but very clearly they may have a broader cultural significance where they're used not at all as trade symbols, but as something else, to communicate your loyalty to a team, or to communicate your particular values in some way. Good.
I see. For example, I'm a fan of Arsenal. Actually, I'm a fan of Arsenal.
Excellent. There's usually at least one person in the class.
I buy the clothes and scarf of the Arsenal club, not because the good quality of the club, clothes or the scarf. A lot of brands have really, really good quality of clothes, but I won't buy that because I'm the fan of Arsenal club. So, because it has the brand on the clothes, that's the only reason I buy this scarf. So that is the cultural significance of this trade symbol.
Yeah, and this is actually a really good explanation of sort of both the power of the brand, but also saying, you're not really buying a shirt, you're buying the ability to participate in a particular culture, in this case a particular sporting culture, in in relation to your specific team, but also sort of more broadly within, the league. And therefore, in some sense, you then make the leap saying, well, actually, the cultural significance here is not really to do with the product. It's the way it allows you to communicate, perhaps with other fans, perhaps with other supporters. So yes, I entirely take your point that what matters here is the trade symbol, not the fact that, say, I don't know, another London club like Chelsea might in fact make better shirts, for example.
I think maybe that's the way to show my relationship with my club.
Yeah, exactly. So, building on these points, does anyone want to hazard, well, some kind of argument about, something in the judgment or in the judgments that sort of supports this view or not? What does the court say? Yeah.
If you support a team, you want to buy something, and the money, and some part of the money will contribute to this team. This is what we want. So we want to pay for the team, but not for a person. So I think maybe we buy this goods just for the team. We want the team to play better and get more money.
Yeah. Well, actually, so this isn't something that I'd considered, but actually this makes a lot of sense, right? So the idea is that maybe at the next transfer window they'll buy a great striker, and therefore it's better to buy like the official thing. But again, you're not simply buying a shirt, you're again saying, this is like a sort of badge of loyalty, but also potentially you're sort of supporting the team in order for your team to do well. Does the court engage with any of these arguments, or any of the courts?
Yeah, I think the Court of
Yeah.
Appeal gave this differentiation. It also held that the use of word arsenal on scarf or the other terms of clothes could have three meanings. A, the owner was a supporter of Arsenal, and B, the good come from Arsenal, C, a combination of about two.
Yeah.
And it's clear evidence to show that there are instances of confusion. I think it shows that it is a brand of support.
Yeah, so this is the interesting thing. When we look at the case, notwithstanding that the ultimate outcome is to say, actually you are infringing, the courts do all recognize the cultural significance of this as a badge of support. But actually, then the way that they interpret the trademark rules specifically doesn't allow them to sort of, in a sense, sort of cash that out. They're sort of constrained. They're saying, well, actually, if the primary function is as a badge of origin, that here you would show that you're a supporter, that the goods came from there, that sort of trumps any other reason that you might have to buy that. So, we can agree or sort of disagree with that. So there is a sort of recognition of the cultural significance of trade symbols, but that recognition isn't enough to overcome the hurdle of the primary function of a trademark is to serve as a badge of origin, and this will be protected above all else, potentially. So again, whatever you've sort of written for this, I think it would be worth revisiting this, certainly in a few weeks' time, when we've done infringement, just to see, I suppose, if your responses have changed. Okay, so that brings us to the second case that we're looking at in the context of sort of the functions and the rationales. And this is L'Oreal and Velour. I'm not going to put up the various sort of pictures. This is a case that we have to come back to in the context of the relative grounds for refusal, so this is something we're going to do immediately. But in short, as you will probably know from your reading already, but if you don't, this is really a case about comparative advertising. And I'm just going to leave aside all of the issues around sort of comparative advertising, the directive, etc., and just focus on, again, the use of various marks. What you have is a sort of, basically you have a seller of perfume, in this case L'Oreal, and then you have a seller of smell-alike perfumes sold under different names in different bottles that smell like the various L'Oreal perfumes. So the idea here again is that nobody's really confused when they buy one of the cheaper perfumes. Nobody thinks that they're actually buying one of the more expensive perfumes. Of course, they get sued anyway. And I will just say, lest we feel too sorry for the smaller competitor, Sort of when you look at sort of the process of litigation, at one point they sort of changed some of their packaging, to make it not quite echo the L'Oreal one. So it's not sort of super clean. I mean, I think they probably knew what they were doing, but at the same time, they were very clearly not putting someone else's trade symbol on their goods. They were simply saying, buy this because it smells like this other more expensive perfume. So there are a few things here that are interesting, but two I want to raise in particular. One is that, I mean, maybe not entirely unusually, here we have the court dealing very specifically with the concept of a brand, even though a trademark is obviously much narrower a concept than a brand, but very clearly references the idea of a brand. It's a collection of intangible values that are attributed to a name or a symbol, in this case, the various names of the L'Oreal perfumes. So that's the first one. It engages with sort of the power of brands. The second point, and this comes not so much from the case, but in particular from the academic commentary, and by the way, probably the most useful academic commentary on this case for you is the Ganji and Burrell case note, which is quite short, from the Modern Law Review, which is in your further reading, is quite useful because they point out that there are issues that are raised, or the criticism that have been raised in the literature around this case about the extent to which trademark law starts to impinge on freedom of expression principles. So in other words, that you can be sued for trademark infringement in a situation where you're not directly using that trademark as a trademark. So all you're simply doing is you're saying this thing is like this other thing. You're not saying that other thing is made by me. So when we think of the origin function, comparison list isn't really problematic from an origin function perspective. Which function does it implicate, however? Anyone? Mm-hmm.
Advertising?
Yeah, absolutely. Advertising, almost certainly also investment, definitely. So not the origin function, but as was the case in L'Oreal, they're saying actually this inhibits our advertising and investment functions. Then the question becomes, well, to what extent do we think that this is appropriate? So what we see here, unlike in the Arsenal case, is we see the ECJ deal specifically with the extended functions of a trademark. And just bearing in mind that really I think L'Oreal is probably sort of the high watermark in terms of this kind of approach. And this is one of sort of the important extracts from that judgment, where the court says these functions include not only the essential function to guarantee origin, but also other functions, in particular in guaranteeing the quality of the goods, and then those of communication, investment, or advertising, so that you're protecting sort of the effort that has gone into building up the power of that brand. So, does anyone remember, if you've read the case already, what does the court mean by a trademark's power of attraction? What's the context in which they use this excellent and useful phrase, really? So it really quite sort of sums up both, I think, a trade symbol and also a brand. Anyone? What's the context that they use it in? If no one's read the case, I'm also not going to make you sort of suffer by sitting there in silence, but if a trade symbol sort of encapsulates this, sort of has this sort of attractive force, can you sort of imagine why the court would have found that this comparative advertiser has infringed? Yeah. Exactly. Yep. So this is precisely the objection. So in that very same paragraph in 49, they say that they are riding on the coattails of this company that has built up through its investment and advertising this incredibly powerful and attractive symbol. So there's very clearly there a concern with, well, actually, it would be it's unfair for you to in some way compete like this. Now, as usual, of course, this goes back to. In fact, I think I'm just trying to think. Is it Lord Justice Jacob both times? Quite possibly. So we're now at 8 AMR 47. It goes back to the English court, and of course, you're having to now apply this particular reason from the ECJ, and this is where it sort of gets a little bit interesting. I am bound to say that I have real difficulty with these functions. That is a really super polite sort of judge's way of saying this is ridiculous. I have real difficulty. This is sort of a polite way of saying I really would prefer not to apply this. And the reason the judge has difficulty with this is saying, well, actually what's happening in this case is that you're moving away from the core function. And the core function is for the particular trademark to act as a badge of origin, but instead you're taking into account these extended functions which are conceptually vague and ill-defined. And the further argument is that made, they're vague and ill-defined. He says, well, of course you've spent lots of money on advertising. This is what advertising is for. Any advertisements by competitors are likely to affect the advertising investment function of another mark. So the argument here is that actually in terms of like the economics of this, this is just what happens. You advertise, but this isn't necessarily something, by implication, that trademark law ought to protect. Now, there's an issue here around, well, that we'll come back to about if you're using a particular mark in the light of sort of comparative advertising, are you using it sort of purely descriptively, which would be okay. So it's not perhaps entirely clear, but he says that one of the difficulties here is, well, how do you draw the line between what is impinging on the advertising and investment functions and what isn't? So I think there's another bit, which if you haven't read it, where he says, I confess I do not know where that line is, but this case falls on the wrong side of it. Why? Because the court has said so. Actually, that probably shows like a little bit more annoyance around this. So basically, when we look at L'Oreal, we can kind of see sort of two arguments. On the one, we're saying, well, we need to protect consumers. On the other hand, we're saying, yes, but also we need to protect the producers. How do you draw that line? So this is when we come back to the functions as we discussed them at the very start and look at them sort of in the context of the public interest. So this is one way that we can frame them. So the origin function, if you focus on that, there's greater transparency for consumers because they know what it is that they're buying. It's supportive of consumer choice in the context of quality. Now, when we get to advertising and investment, it's not really clear whether we're reducing or increasing consumer welfare. I mean, if you have a comparative advertising list, that's just information for consumers, right? And nobody's confused. That's one argument. On the other one, you're saying, well, maybe we ought to protect the ability of the particular trademark owner to communicate with the customers. So you could say sort of in a very sort of roundabout way that protecting the investment function is possibly related to protecting the origin function because you're advertising and you're investing in making it very clear that this particular trade symbol is associated with those particular goods. I mean, there are, I don't know, it's advertising, so I suppose there are probably arguments here about how transparent this really is in terms of consumers. But I think there are sort of certainly issues around L'Oreal. There are these tensions between, I think, consumer protection, consumer welfare, and then sort of concerns around unfair competition. And it may well be that, I don't know, perhaps the consumers get caught in the crossfire a little bit. So what other arguments can we then come up with in the context of these two slightly controversial cases, L'Oreal in particular and also Arsenal? We can say, well, we should continue to provide a property right in relation to trademarks, because this might encourage, these are, by the way, very nicely summarized, these ones in particular in the Bentley textbook. It supports creativity and innovation. You know, this is sort of potentially quite useful, and you should be able to get a property right associated with the thing that you've sort of created or invented. It provides information to consumers, therefore reduces consumer search costs. In other words, it makes it easier for consumers to identify what they are buying. It's fair. So this relates to the question of, well, it's fair to provide a property right to a company or a person in their trade symbol. Because, you know, they're the ones who have invested in it, and also this makes sort of sense from a competition perspective. And then finally, it might encourage market efficiency because it prevents misrepresentation. Now, that obviously sort of sets aside the fact that obviously some brand owners are going to be much more powerful than others. So, you know, what we might mean by efficiency here, you sort of may or may not find convincing. So all of that, so everything that we've done so far is just saying, well, these are the ways where even if you did nothing else, just by looking at sort of technically the reasoning in Arsenal and in L'Oreal, you can come up with an argument about what the trademark functions are, how they relate with each other, and what they tell you about the relationship between producers and consumers, and then between different producers who are competing. What I want to do now is to sort of expand that, and in some sense sort of hark back to the Littman work from 2 weeks ago, to look at also in sort of the Arsenal question, to look at sort of the cultural or sort of the broader significance of trademarks. So why is any of this controversial? So why is L'Oreal controversial? Or why is perhaps the decision in Arsenal might be controversial, say, for fans? It's because obviously these trade symbols, they don't exist in some kind of vacuum where it's just something that you see in a supermarket, or it's something that you only ever engage with as a matter of a commercial transaction. What we see, especially in the critical accounts of trademarks, is that a trademark gives you a property right and therefore allows you to restrain the use of that symbol. So it gives you a particular communicative power. So a really good, I think, summary of that, although here in relation to intellectual property law as a whole, is that IP allows for the commodification of symbols. So in this case, the commodification of the trade symbol is that it becomes a registered trademark. That registered trademark is property, it's been commodified. You can now assign it, or license it, etc. If you have that protection, you may, or you won't necessarily, but you may control the sign's circulation and its connotations. Can anyone explain to me what that means? Say in the context of, yep.
I think you can forbid people to use it, so
Yep.
you can limit the circulation that way and also influence what context it's put in.
Yeah, and that's exactly her argument, that once you sort of propertize these symbols, it gives you actually power of how they're used, not just by you, say, and your competitors, but also sort of more broadly than that. So the BP case in relation to oil, the idea would be that that should be able to stop you from people perhaps in practice it doesn't actually, from actually using it in ways that you dislike. Absolutely, that's exactly what she's talking about, that kind of control. And interestingly, actually, I'm just going to mention it here. I'm pretty sure that we come back to it in a few weeks, but in the Google and Louis Vuitton case, oh no, we might actually do it, it might actually be next term. But in the AG's opinion in that case, the AG says that actually there are certain expressions and signs that effectively become public goods. And this is kind of what she's talking about. So they are public goods, they are turned into private goods through law, so they're turned into private property. But actually, because they have this public element, that trademark law has to be quite careful not to restrain other uses, so other forms of communication. So I suppose the question for us then is, does trademark law appropriately draw the line between appropriate and inappropriate uses? Again, not perhaps something that we can answer directly in this class, but I can provide an example. So this is Rosemary Coombe writing in the Canadian context, but actually is perhaps more useful to us anyway. She says, well, she uses the example of the Olympics. We'll come back to this next term when we look at sporting events. And she says, well, they have an official protection. They have trademark protection and they have sort of broader Olympic sign protection. We'll look at this in the context of the London Olympics. And yet very clearly, it's also a sign that's in sort of public circulation. People use and they use to communicate. In particular as well, there will be other symbols. We don't actually need to, you don't actually need to know anything about the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, right, to look at this, but she's giving it as an example of, you have particular also official signifiers, which will be protected as trademarks. So in the UK, I can't remember whether I've mentioned this already, you have a whole host of protected emblems. Literally, the trademarks manual says, here are pictures of some crowns that you definitely can't use, and here are pictures of crowns that you can. Here are the images of every member of the royal family and their names. You absolutely cannot use those. Anyone else by implication, you can. So there are sort of official signs that are protected. So the argument that's being made here is that it's very useful as an official signifier of power to have trademark protection. You get a property right that will allow you to exclude other people from using that particular symbol. Now, we can see that that might raise particular issues commercially, but the point that Rosemary Coombe is making is that it may also raise particular issues sort of politically if you want to use certain sort of officially recognized symbols. And the reason that's important, of course, is that you may want to make a particular political argument, and then you might sort of run up against sort of the limits of trademark law. Like, we're leaving sort of the issue of whether there can be use, but this is sort of the argument that she's making, sort of cautioning that it actually matters whether you can register something as a trademark or not. And that sort of brings us perhaps to two further accounts of critical accounts of trademarks. And there are two critiques in particular, one from feminist theory and the other one, broadly sort of speaking, from critical race studies. And the points that are made here is, the main point is to say that the grant of a particular legal right, or in this case the grant of a property right, ought not to be considered politically neutral. I mean, this is sort of, perhaps sort of pretty sort of obvious. It isn't neutral that you're granted this property right in a particular sign. Why isn't it neutral is the argument in not just sort of this particular article but in others. It's because once let's say you have, and obviously in this class we are absolutely not going to use any of the terms that are used in relation to, in terms of these examples. Specifically, not interested even remotely, and we're not going to use any of the racially stereotyping words that they use. The point that I want to make more broadly and that they make is that if you allow someone to register that stereotypical word, or something that is racist, or in other way problematic, you're basically saying actually that that's okay. You have these apparently sort of neutral rules that allow you to register trademarks, but actually what you're doing is sort of reproducing particular unequal power relations. So it's not neutral that you should be able to register that word or not, which is obviously, Green puts it in a sort of much nicer way, where he says, in sort of a, not nicer is the wrong word, in a sort of more powerful way, saying actually what it does is to sort of create this impression of, or continue to create sort of gender and racial subordination. So in other words, saying, these symbols are powerful, and whether you're sort of able to trademark a particular symbol to get that property right, it sort of says something about what's valued. So this is sort of going sort of well beyond, sort of badges of support, and going sort of away from sort of this sort of cultural participation to saying, actually, politically these things matter. So you can see there that we've gone from 1927 classic exposition of, this is just a badge of origin, to actually this allows you to participate in the social, cultural, and sort of sporting life of a country, to actually this really matters for political speech. So this is the context that we're looking at. Sort of from you're buying and selling something to actually this fundamentally matters to, how people conceive of themselves, say, and of their country. Okay, so this is sort of something, again, that we'll sort of come back to, and something that you can use in your own analysis of the various cases. But before we get to that next week, I want to just run very quickly through sort of where we are in terms of how you actually register your rights. So obviously trademarks may be registered or unregistered. As I've mentioned, you want it to be registered because you get your property right. This gives you a significant amount of power in terms of preventing the use of others. The other point to note is that there is a trademarks directive. There is also the EU trademark regulations. UK trademark law is fully harmonised. In fact, the most recent changes came into effect on the 14th of January of this year. So this sort of incorporating the changes from the EU trademark regulation. So this is all in the Trademarks Act. We're also sort of meeting international obligations. That will also matter, incidentally, to passing off, because the way the UK gets around the sort of the unfair competition elements of the Paris Convention is they say, oh, we have passing off. That deals with sort of that part of it. So again, we're going to be looking at UK trademarks. However, a lot of the cases that we'll also look at will be EU cases, because obviously they're going to be highly relevant. So in terms of our route to registration that we're primarily interested in, it's the UK Intellectual Property Office route, where you go there and you say, this is my mark, my logo, or my word, or whatever it is. They examine it against the absolute grounds for refusal, which we'll do next week. It's then published, and people can oppose it. These are the relative grounds for refusal, which we'll do in 2 weeks' time. And then once the trademark is registered, someone may still sue you for trademark infringement, at which point, as we'll see sort of 3 weeks from now, your trademark might be revoked. But that's roughly sort of the route that we're looking at. And just to go back, although we've now discussed the lease classification, it's prescribed in Section 34 of the Trademarks Act. This is just another example. This is from Class 30. which covers coffee, tea, and the like, and then is sort of very specific, including aniseed, apple sauce, artificial coffee, baking powder, pancake batters, etc. Now, something that might be quite useful, although we're not expected to do it in this much detail, also I realise that you can't read it. This will be something for me to put on Moodle, is that in practice, the registration route can be a little bit complicated. But in short, you apply, it's examined. Like I said, you go to the absolute grounds for refusal. If you pass over that hurdle, you move to the relative grounds where someone may or may not oppose you, and then you sort of carry on. The key point for us to note in relation to the routes for registration is that if you want to sell things in the UK, you want a UK trademark. If you want to sell things sort of EU-wide, you are in fact much better off making an application for an EU trademark, at which point it's the EU trademark regulations that regulate that registration rather than the Trademarks Act. Of course, given it's harmonised, we're looking at the same rules. What you can also do is that you can make an international application. However, that will still require the particular sign to be examined in each individual office, whether it's the UK or the EU. So this will be a sort of commercial decision to be made. Okay, and finally, that brings us to Brexit and sort of the current position. Now, for our purposes, the law is currently harmonised. It's a very, very high level of harmonisation. We know that it's been fully harmonised with the EU TMR as of January. In relation to what will happen if, when Brexit happens, the European Union Withdrawal Act of last year, does everyone know what this does? I never quite. No? Okay, maybe just the students who, if anyone sort of did anything public law related last year. This is basically an act of the UK Parliament which says, 1, EU law will not apply after the withdrawal date. So after Brexit, EU law stops applying. However, number 2, all EU law, this therefore includes trademark law, will be transposed into domestic law. So this is effectively sort of ensuring continuity. So can I just say that this means that in effect, assuming that there is a sort of agreement, etc., this is not, it doesn't seem that this is something that will affect your exam. I realise that there are bigger issues than obviously the exam, but for our purposes at least, what we're looking at least at the moment, right now, is a sort of continuation of these rules. So what will the position be after the 31st of October? By the way, I don't know whether it's the 31st of October. The Ben Act suggests that there will probably, an extension will need to be asked for. If anyone knows what's going to happen, you probably know more than like all the public lawyers who are out there who are sort of working on this. But whenever the actual date is, we have sort of 2 things to look for, and this of course will be important to you because some of you at least will probably end up practicing in this area. And the question is, well, are we going to continue to see convergence with EU rules, or will we see a divergence in terms of UK trademark law? Now, the reason this is important is that Section 6 of this Act provides that courts may continue to have regard to the judgments of the EU court. So actually, in practice, notwithstanding the outcome, if it may well be possible that there continues to be convergence with trademark laws. Now, the final point to note here, which you may or may not be wondering, is basically what happens to you if you have an EU trademark but not specifically a UK one. The answer is probably, even if there's no agreement, based on some of the guidance that's been published, and it's a little bit unclear, is that all of those trademarks will continue to be recognized, even if there's no agreement. But actually this isn't clear. So possibly if the UK is a very important market, I don't know, I'd be interested to know whether you're actually just applying for a UK trademark just to be on the safe side, because this remains a little bit unclear. The position is potentially actually even more problematic for geographical indications, which would just stop applying without an agreement. So this of course goes both ways. This is potentially sort of economically quite problematic. Okay, are there any questions? Just saying, if you have a question about Brexit, I will probably not be able to answer it, but I will take it. Are there any questions about the material in today's class? Yes?
I couldn't particularly find out, it maybe says it in some of the regulations, but when you renew a trademark, do the absolute grounds for refusal get looked at again?
I wouldn't have thought so. I don't think so. I can check, but I can't imagine that they would unless maybe the rules have changed in the meantime.